Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream with yet another august panel. John Geocast, Jeffrey Tyler Sick, and Blake Fisher of The Homeless Conservative. Three individuals who are all insightful in their own right. And we're speaking this evening, even though he's got another month left to go in office. President Biden is, in some respects, the lamest of lame ducks, it seems. This far out. And I don't know how many of you watching were like me, but earlier this month, when it was announced that Biden was pardoning his son Hunter, my first thought was, oh, yeah, he's still president, isn't he? And it's not that I didn't know that. It's just it didn't register with me somehow. I don't think about it all that often. So he's still there. God bless him. Hopefully he'll still be there until January 20th, I guess, when they officially transition power. But I don't necessarily think it's premature to do some sort of a critique over all of the administration. I doubt in the next 30 days he's going to do something to radically alter our opinion of him that much more. With that, this is a relatively open-ended conversation. Any of you three gentlemen are welcome to give your thoughts. But good, bad, or indifferent, how has this first and only Biden presidency been, in your opinions?
Oh boy, who's going to go first? This is
it's maybe not the only one. He could run again.
That's true.
Comes roaring back in 2028 to give us the Biden-Trump matchup we wanted again. It'll be Junior this time, but
Dark Biden's coming back.
That's pretty good, actually. That's a pretty good impression. So I tried to be pretty fair about this. Because we talked about this, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try to be as fair without putting on rose-tinted glasses about what are his wins, what are his losses, is it fair, all these kind of things. Because I think it's pretty fair to say that most presidents have some things that happened in their administration that really they either didn't have any control over, although I think part of the problem there is that presidents pretend they have control over a bunch of stuff that they don't when they're campaigning. So then I think it's somewhat right to get the blame for not being able to control the economy, because, you can't really do that from the presidency. So sometimes it's their own fault. But, every president has things that are thrust upon them. And sometimes you end up looking back and go, well, maybe it's not really fair to blame them entirely for that. I don't think almost anything that happened during Biden's, though, is really some sort of outside force. I just can't find the excuse to go, they try to blame everyone else. So Afghanistan is Trump's plan. Inflation was Trump's inflation. If they even admit that it is inflation. So I just felt like it's thing after thing where they try to blame it on someone else, and they try to go. My favorite thing during this last campaign was we're not going back and sort of this talk about, guys, the Republicans have only been in power for 4 of the last 20 years. What are you talking about? They keep talking about all these terrible things. And it's okay, Obama was president for 8 years. We had 4 years of Trump, and then we had 4 years of Biden. That's a lot. And I just don't understand what the constant finger pointing. I guess everyone does this with politicians. It just seems like he did it more than anyone else that I've ever seen in my lifetime, at least, everything that's bad is the guy that came before me's fault, but not the guy that came before him because he was my boss. It's just been a really weird thing, as if everything bad that happened, inflation, taxes, pick your Democratic issue, it only happened between 2016 and 2020. And that just seems unrealistic to me. And so I think that's the first thing that he's got as a problem, is that they want to blame everyone else, but it's pretty clear from the last election that he was being blamed for everything that people didn't like over the last 4 years. I think it was mostly the economy and the border, but I think it comes down to a lot of other things, even when you get down to the minutia of, I think he's right on supporting Ukraine, but I don't think he did it in the right way. He slow rolled everything. So I think he actually made that situation worse. So even on the things where he got, yes, I agree. We're on the same page with Israel. We're on the same page with Ukraine. But then the way he slow rolls it, or tells Israel over and over again not to do something, and then they do it, and they capture the leader of they kill the leader of a Hamas, and he's telling them not to go into Rafah. It's it's good you didn't ever listen to Biden. So it's weird, even on the things that he got, he's in the right lane, I guess, he still manages to screw up. I just think that his legacy's not going to be good, as much as Democrats tried to suck up to him when they needed him out of the race so they could put someone else in there that had a chance of beating Trump. we've got all these sort of accolades. I don't really believe that any Democrat, even right now, feels that way about him. And I think that's the reason history is not going to be kind to him, is because they won't say it out loud a lot. But I think most Democrats are very pissed off at Joe Biden right now. And I don't see that subsiding, like, just because the election gets a little further in the rearview mirror.
I think Blake is being much more charitable to Biden than I would be. One thing I will lay at the square, actually many things I will lay square on his feet in terms of how his legacy will be remembered. I think it'll be remembered as more than $4 trillion in discretionary spending in his first 2 years in office, which led to a 40-year high spike in national inflation, fostering the worst border crisis in illegal immigration in U.S. history by blowing up every existing border policy and security measure on day one, stopping the border wall, halting deportations, remain in Mexico, Title 42, you go on down the list. Disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan that flushed 20 years of blood and treasure down the drain within a matter of weeks. Unprecedented attempt at expanding executive authority by trying to impose a nationwide vaccine mandate and eviction moratorium, both of which were returned by the court. Trying his damnedest to bribe young voters on student loan debt forgiveness, which was effectively an attempt to transfer $430 billion worth of student loans from the 1/3 of adults who went to college to the 2/3 who didn't. Supreme Court stopped him on that too. Crossing the Rubicon on political lawfare when the sitting president's DOJ indicted a former president and political opponent, something no former president, including Trump, by the way, ever dared to do. Granting his own son a sweeping full pardon for any wrongdoing, rivaled probably only by the Gerald Ford pardon of Richard Nixon. And he easily broke the record on 39 other pardons and 1,500 other commutations in a single day. I think, and confirming a hell of a lot of Article 3 judges, that'll give him. But that's pretty much going to be the legacy of Joe Biden, in my opinion.
Yeah, and what's funny is even the stuff you mentioned, which is all absolutely true, almost every one of those he tried to blame someone else for. The border, he said, I can't do anything about. Congress has to do it, even though it was like his pen that undid it, and then his pen that redid it 8 months ago or whatever. Almost every single thing you listed there was something that he still claims that either he didn't do or wasn't responsible for, which is also crazy to me.
So I mostly agree. And I actually think what Joe Biden will mostly be remembered for is kind of the implosion of his own party on his watch, in part because of these policies. But this is not actually, to his credit, I guess this is something that's been going on a long time for Democrats, kind of bleeding of working class voters. I do think, though, I would defend him a little bit on foreign policy. I think he will actually be remembered mostly as a good foreign policy president. It is not evident to me that there was any scenario left in Afghanistan that would either we stay for another 20 years or we leave and it looks something like what happened. I think Ukraine, I think slow rolling was more or less a good idea. It bogs Russia down. All-out victory would require us to be far more involved than I think Americans have any appetite to be. Turns out we don't even have the appetite for the involvement we currently have. But I think he tried to manage public opinion there kind of wisely. And Israel, very pro-Israel. I think Israel was unjustly attacked, but I also think the Israeli government poses certain threats to the Abraham Accords, which are ironically crafted by Trump, but represent probably the best hope for long-term Middle East peace. And so trying to get Israel to rein in itself, some of its instincts a little bit good. So I think Biden should get credit for all that. I think he probably will. But it'll be overshadowed largely by a kind of directionless, incompetent, feckless presidency of a kind of aged, out of touch, incompetent man.
Yeah, I mean, the age, it's funny that's the first time you brought up the age thing. I mean, we all brought up a million things, and you're probably right. That will be the thing. I was thinking, okay, forget history books. What do you think the first 5 things people would mention in an article when he dies, or maybe like the very short blurb in history books? Like, what do you think they'll be? I mean, I
beat Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be the meltdown at the debate. Yep. That would definitely be one of them. And I think the totally avoidable problem that he put his party in. I mean,
yeah,
it was so foreseeable. In fact, everyone to the right of I mean, Bernie Sanders, I think, saw that this is what was going to happen.
It's so foreseeable that when he ran for president the first time, he foresaw and said he wouldn't run again.
Yes.
This is how foreseeable it was, and somewhere
Yeah.
he forgot his own sense.
Yeah, and so
I do think, and all these other things you complain about, I think whether they are or not a product of his age will probably be attributed to his age by like your average lay person.
I also think we're just going to learn a lot more about what was actually happening. It's just undeniable, especially with all the fighting between the sort of Harris, Biden, Obama camps. Like there's kind of 3 different factions there. And there's no way we're not going to get the best sort of Bob Woodward book in like maybe February. I don't know. It might not even take that long, because you start like after that debate, you just saw so many things come out where everyone was like, well, I saw this too. All of a sudden, everyone's being really honest about what they saw 2 years ago. I think that's going to be more of a stain on the party and the media. I think that really hurts them more than it hurts Biden, but it will be the thing that people bring up. There's that meltdown and the chaos that put his party in. And even the fact that he didn't step down for like a month after that it just shows the selfishness that I've argued that I do not think Biden is that much different than Trump. I think they're actually way more similar than people think. People think Joe Biden's this kind Uncle Joe. And I think I love the Charlie Cook article that was like, he's an a-hole. Like, it was like, he's not kind. He lies all the time. I think he's very insecure about his intellect. And so he rages at people instead. And I think he knows he's mediocre, and he just somehow got to the presidency, which should be kind of a stain on the Democratic Party, in my opinion, that he really ever got there. I mean, he's just not that good at this.
I would be interested to see that next Bob Woodward book. It has been a mystery to me for a long time why administrations from both parties continue to give Bob Woodward as much information as they do, and always think they're going to come out smelling like a rose. But more power to him if he can get that done. But
that's the hubris of the average politician. That they actually do think they are great. Well, they wouldn't be in the business.
Don't you think there's a staffing thing too, though, where certain aides and stuff want to kind of clear their names?
Oh yeah,
I think so. And I
absolutely want the dish.
That's
just a thing.
I'm as much in awe of Woodward's ability to get the information as I am in confusion as to certain individuals giving it. Staffers, absolutely. But when the presidents themselves fork over information, it's like, I don't know how to help you, dude. But anyhow, I wanted to, because I know that I have somewhat of a left of center audience, in the minority, of course, but they do listen. And I know I've had many conversations with our friends on the left, and I should probably specify when I say left, I'm not referring to the diehard socialist Bernie bro necessarily. They don't. I have some of those friends too. They tend to agree with a lot of our critiques of Biden. Yeah. They just think he should have gone further left rather than right. You know, they have different solutions, but they agree with the critiques. I mean, rather those that would argue strongly, look, Biden, by certain measurements, was had one of the most successful policy presidencies, arguably, of recent memory. And the reason I bring that up, and I'm not necessarily saying we have to agree with that statement, but that they would then say with an equal breath, and he was running against a convicted convict who tried to overthrow an election. Again, we don't necessarily have to agree with that statement. I think the problem, though, is it puts many of the Democrats in this position where they have a harder time coming to terms with what happened, because it's easier to reach for kind of extreme answers of racism explains this or ignorance explains this, because how could we look, for all of Biden's faults, even if they do admit them, this is Uncle Joe. He loves his country. He was never going to perpetrate a January 6th. He was never the racist that Trump was. How could we have lost to Trump? And I recognize it was Harris that actually lost, not Biden. But the point is, I think that
I lost it for her, though. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, like,
sure,
she should be blamed for her loss, because and it could have been anyone other than Kamala. I don't think that they could have. I don't think any Democrat could have won without seriously distancing themselves from him. Like, he was the reason the Democrats, I think, were in the position they were in. I think it's fair to say that.
Certainly, he played a role in the Democratic Party's loss. I guess all I'm saying is I don't know to what I think it's difficult if you're in that position of thinking we're literally running against a fascist dictator, and to whatever degree they believe that. Some of them, I think, literally do, and others have variants of that idea. it's difficult, I think, to be honest with yourself about these very things we're talking about the failure of the Biden administration, because you can do that without saying Biden's Hitler. You can do that without saying Biden's as bad as Trump is. Somebody can be a decent person. You know, in a lot of ways, Jimmy Carter is a pretty decent person. A terrible president.
Yeah, it doesn't.
A pretty decent person.
Yeah. I think the question when it comes to that is what did people vote? Why did people vote for Biden in 2020? Like, what would we say the reasons are? I think everyone would agree in general they wanted someone that was not Trump. And out of the Democratic field, they obviously did not want a super progressive, left-wing identity politics. It was very clear that got rejected in the Democratic primaries. The lesson people thought they learned in 2016 was, oh, Bernie Sanders got close to beating Hillary Clinton. We must need to go all in on the democratic socialism thing. And everyone ran that way. I mean, I would argue Kamala Harris is more like that than she was who she ran this year. But I don't think she's actually as crazy lunatic left, even as she was in the primaries, because everyone thought that's what they had to do. And it was her and Elizabeth Warren and all these people were competing for this far left thing. And Joe Biden comes in and goes, I want to be a normal Democrat. Clearly black women, like, essentially he owes his presidency to black women in like South Carolina. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it was very clear that no one wanted the woke thing. No one wanted the identity politics thing. No one wanted to change the Supreme Court structure. No one wanted any of these things that he then decided to go after. And so, and then the other thing he's supposed to be is not Trump. And Trump leaves office because he doesn't get removed by the Senate. The Senate doesn't, I think, in my opinion, do the right thing and what they should have done. And I think he should have been convicted in that second impeachment. And because they didn't do that, this guy's going to run again in 4 years. So I would think that the mandate, if there is such a thing, would be protect the country from Trump. That's what you claim you were doing when you ran in 2020. He did absolutely nothing to rein in executive power. In fact, he abused it more, just like every president does. He continued most of Trump's bad policies, in my opinion, like the tariffs and stuff that Trump implemented. Biden just said, yeah, let's keep doing that. And did nothing in those first 2 years when he has the House and Senate to rein in the executive power, to do things like, you could clarify some stuff in law. You could actually protect the country from who you claim is a fascist dictator. He did none of those things and then ran again when he said he wasn't going to, and then put his party in the country. So my point is, everything that they said and claimed about Trump, they either don't really believe, which is what I believe, is because none of their actions line up with what they say. And I do think Trump has some, like you said, he tried to steal an election. The only thing Congress did since then is clarify that language to say that the vice president, like, clearly, absolutely cannot change the election. That's all they did. That's all they insulated.
For a moment, it looked like they weren't even going to do that.
Right. And that almost didn't happen. So, I mean, if I could be Joe Biden, I would go, okay, what do people want me to be? I think he could have been one of the most consequential presidents if he just would have done a couple things. I think he could have gone to the Senate before he's even president and been like, what do you guys want in return for convicting Trump? Because if that's the priority, if the priority really was that Trump's that big of a threat, you would give Senate Republicans whatever they want to make that happen, right? I mean, if he really is Hitler, like you claim he is, if he's really a fascist. So again, I don't believe you. And then second of all, just be normal and do what you said you were going to do, and don't cave in to your 20-year-old lefty staffers. Like, if he wouldn't have done the second COVID spending, which economists told him not to, told him it would do exactly what it did, you wouldn't have the inflation. If he tweaks the Afghanistan thing, possibly it's a little better. Yeah, I think you're mostly right, probably, that doesn't turn out a lot different no matter how long you delay it. But I think if you've got generals saying this is going to be a disaster and it's going to be on camera and it's going to look like us leaving Vietnam, and you don't listen to them, and then you either lie or you can't remember, like I said, either way. And then beyond all of that stuff that you could have done to protect us, you choose to run again, even though you said you weren't going to, when we know you're too old, your staff's covering for you, the media's covering for you, the whole party's covering for you. You kind of screw your party, you screw your country, and we're right back to where we would have been. It's like the 4 years didn't happen in a way. It's like Trump's going to be president. He's more vindictive than he's ever been because of all the lawfare stuff, and whether you agree that it's lawfare or not. I think he also I would have pardoned Trump, and with a caveat that you can't run again. That's the other thing I would have done. And I think Trump would have taken that deal. I think if Biden said, I will pardon you for everything federally, but you can't run again, you've got to, take that deal. And Biden would have been hated by the left for it, but I think it would have been the right thing to do. potentially. So he just didn't do anything. Even though he got legislation passed, even that stuff, it's a bunch of legislation that's gone nowhere. We have no chargers, that even though they paid for a bunch of chargers. We've got no further broadband access. That was another huge thing that he talks about all the time. Like almost none of these things have actually been implemented in any way that affected any voters' minds, which is why they got so totally rejected in November.
You know, I hardly consider myself a MAGA conservative, and I got plenty of Trump acolyte friends who give me crap all the time because they think I'm too tough on them. But I thought there was just something weird and ironic about the fact that on the one hand, progressives were screaming bloody murder that if Trump gets back in office, he's going to go after his political enemies and he's going to sue his political opponents and he's going to do this and he's going to do that. That's all I saw from the Biden administration. I mean, again, they crossed the Rubicon on indicting a former president and using their DOJ to go after their political opponent. For all the panic and hysteria I heard about, all the bad things Trump is going to do or did in office in his first term, and how he's trying to enrich himself, and he's trying to enrich his family. And then Biden turns around and grants his son a full pardon of anything he might have ever done or ever will do after January 1st of 2014. I mean, I don't know. It just to me it just seems like so much projection against their political opponent, while they're actually doing in reality what they're afraid that Trump is going to do.
It's because they use that bad behavior that someone might do. This is what both sides are doing now. It's, you might do something bad, so I better do something bad preemptively to prevent you from doing the bad thing I think you're going to do. And we just keep doing that back and forth without really the other side doing the thing that they 100%. Say they're doing.
100%. It's all preemptive action. I know. And I hear this from the far right too. There's, I mean, again, I thought, part of the whole point of winning this election was that we could preserve the Senate filibuster. Right. And I'll hear elements of the far right saying, now that we're in power, we should torch it because they're going to do it anyway. So we have to preemptively do it so that we beat them to it. And I'm like, no. I thought the whole point of this election was to preserve the Senate filibuster, to preserve our originalist majority on the Supreme Court, right? So I fully agree that the extremes can drive each other so nuts that they just end up doing what they claim the other side is going to do. But my point here is that, for all this talk about, how Biden was such a kind person and he was so much better than Trump, we needed someone who wasn't Trump. It's like, yeah, but he was doing a lot of the things that they claimed Trump was going to do. And for all the talk about his legislative accomplishments, how he was the most successful president, in modern history because he passed this and he passed that. At the end of the day, the vast majority of those legislative accomplishments essentially boiled down to just spending tens of trillions of dollars. That's all it was. Whether it was the COVID relief bill, which was effectively a federal bailout for long fiscally mismanaged blue states and blue cities when we're all back in the red again, or whether it was the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that doesn't have a lot to show for it 3 years later, as you mentioned, Blake, because it's got all these ridiculous climate change conditions attached to the funding, all these strings attached that no one can really build anything without showing their climate change plan first, or something ridiculous like that. Whether it was the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, which was just $787 billion worth of green energy subsidies, ACA subsidies, 80 billion funding for the IRS. It was all just a ton of spending. That's all it really was.
Yeah.
So if that's what qualifies as legislative accomplishments today, okay, fine. I mean, maybe that's where the bar is now. But I just dispute that he was that successful of a president in the modern era when all he really just ended up doing was adding a hell of a lot of red ink.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Josh. Like, do you actually have people that do sort of actively defend him? Because I really just don't. I know lots of liberals and Democrats and stuff. I don't know almost anyone that is with him. Because you're right. If they're far left, generally they don't like him because he wasn't progressive enough, and they think that's the lesson that we should have learned from the last 4 years, is that he wasn't progressive enough, and that Kamala Harris wasn't. I think they're wrong about that lesson, but I get where they're coming from. But then the moderate people, it's like I watched that debate with my Democrat friend, like my longtime best friend. And we were both like, this is a disaster. There was no, you couldn't. So I'm just curious, like, do you have people that are still kind of have those goggles on?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, it's part of the unfortunate nature of the country we currently live in is that most of us dwell in bubbles, and so I'm sure those people are out there in droves, and the four of us may just not interact with them all that much. I would say they run the gambit. As I mentioned, the far left has always been critical of Biden.
Right.
You have your more moderate Democrats that will take kind of a balanced approach. Most of them would admit something like the debate that was a disaster. He should, it was, I think in a lot of ways, it was the culmination of something we all knew, but we were actually allowed to say it out loud at that moment. By we, I mean those that were pro-Biden say. Now is the moment
yeah,
where the scales fell off and we could all say this. But even among that crowd, they were far more reticent or I shouldn't say reticent. They were far more willing when Biden made the decision to step down to see it as this act of extreme humility, this very patriotic act of how, and to a certain degree, look, I do credit the guy for stepping down. He didn't. We might have an alternative history in which he clung to the bitter end. No one could force him to do that. I mean, maybe.
Well, it sounds like he got forced. I mean, it sounds like pretty much.
I think to the extent they could have. I just mean if he was truly, unwilling, he could have hung on.
I mean, it sounds like the narrative was, "Hey, we're all turning against you come Tuesday. If you haven't made the decision for yourself, it will get made for you." And
I don't know if we'll ever know the full story. I think we can guess and probably take educated guesses at that, but that's probably what happened. But
if Kamala wants to run for something again, we will hear the story.
Well, yeah, there's going to be a situation we will, but
she's the one that got screwed the most of anyone in this situation. And if she wants to run for something else again, I think there will be a story that says, like, we talked about this years ago. There's going to be, I promise you, there was a crew of people that tried to convince him after the midterms in 2022.
Yeah,
that you should ride off into the sunset. Like, you could be think of the good you could do.
It's an opportunity missed, and but like I say, these people run the gambit because they're far more, I don't want to say apologetic of Biden. Maybe that's the right way to say it, but they're more given to, something like, say, for instance, Afghanistan was always going to be a debacle. Hey, at least he got us out of it. We've had two previous presidents promised to do so and never accomplished it. With a spend, oftentimes they will say, and John, I'm with you on the spending. I think that, and it's not just Biden. It was Trump. It was Obama. It was Bush. It's just been insane. And it tears me up that so much of the country doesn't seem to share our idea of stop spending just trillions. That being said, a lot of times they will say, well, but look at all the damage that could have been done had we not spent the money. They will look at it as it was a positive good. And I'm probably in the minority here on the right. I don't fault Biden too much for inflation. Partially because it was a global phenomenon, partially because I think COVID had more to do with it, partially because I think if it was all about the spending, we would have seen just as much in previous administrations. I'm not for the spending. I'm just more concerned about the growing debt and its stranglehold on the economy. I'm not saying it didn't have an effect on inflation. I think we just have this sometimes understandable, simplistic, we spent a lot of money, prices went up, Biden's fault. Excellent for campaigning, but I think in reality, the real danger is more long-term, and what we just keep adding to this bill year after year. All that said, I guess it's a mixed bag. Some of them, and I think, we're all humans. We kind of do this. I think like you can get a lot of Democrats these days to kind of admit, yeah, Bill Clinton was a sexual predator.
Right.
Couldn't do that in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of Republicans. I know there'll be plenty of Republicans will be a lot more clear-eyed about Donald Trump years after he's out of office and is just sort of an afterthought. We kind of do this, and as I often say, I think one of the great lessons for me, anyways, of the Trump era is, but for the grace of God, there go I. We're human. We're capable of deceiving ourselves, and we ought to constantly be vigilant not to do so.
Yeah, I think the problem there, though, is that Bill Clinton had a lot of successes and then had this, thing that I think this is one of those things that drives me crazy, because I think conservatives were proven right in the Bill Clinton stuff, that it did matter and that the character did matter. And it wasn't just about his sex life. It was that he was like taking advantage of his powerful situation.
We're proven right, and then nominated Donald Trump. So
Right, yeah.
it's like, well, okay, well,
Yeah,
who's the hypocrite here?
We don't get to do the moral. We don't get to be the moral police at all, because then you let Donald Trump in. And so the difference was that Bill Clinton, had a lot of successes. He still he did a ton for his party. I mean, there's all these, he's a consequential president. Biden just doesn't have it. I don't think he has enough in the win column to outweigh that bad, even if you're a Democrat. So, because like I said, if you're a Democrat right now and Donald Trump gets a second term, mostly because of even if you don't think it's because of Biden's failures, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the election results were we do not like Biden-Harris administration. We like nothing about it, essentially. It was a rejection of that more than it was embrace of Trump. I think that you can't look at all the check marks against Trump and then say that he got new every demographic, he got more in every county almost. Do you see that New York Times? I think it was New York Times had that map of basically the direction of almost every county. And it was basically, 2,850 red arrows pointing to the right that he increased. And then there's a few blue arrows. It was not very many. And it was just very clear that it was a rejection of Democrats. Well, I think that he's going to get the blame, which means Democrats are pissed off about it. And so I just don't think that, whereas Clinton's writing out of the second term, and I think he had a lot of successes. I think Obama has a similar situation. I think Obama's a little similar in the sense, I think that it took a little while to realize that maybe he wasn't as accomplished as they hoped that he would have been. But it's not like he left a bad taste in their mouth or screwed the party in some sort of way. And I just think Biden has. And that's why I think it's going to be a lot faster this time with Biden than it was for 20 years to take to admit that Clinton was bad, or the Me Too movement to kind of make people admit that. I think this one will be much faster. I think that it might be the midterms before we see people just actively running against what Biden did.
I think you're right, Blake, and I do. I'm sorry, I don't want this to be the Blake and Josh hour. I will certainly let the rest of you jump in, but I also think that some of that is I think you're right. I think perceptively Biden is going to age. Maybe an odd choice of words there.
Yeah, well,
his legacy, because he's already done that.
Yeah.
His legacy is going to tank faster than say any sort of retrospective Clinton and Obama. And Clinton and Obama's legacy didn't tank in the eyes of the Democrats. They're just a little bit more clear-eyed about their willingness to criticize him. But the 1994 congressional, the largest red wave we've had, in our lifetimes, took place in Clinton's first administration. There was active talk of maybe this guy shouldn't run again. Yeah. Obama, I think, if you look at Obama's 8 years as president, lost more congressional and state races for his party than, I don't know, a century.
Yeah.
And so I think we get such tunnel vision with the president. I'm not saying it's not a big deal. I'm not saying that people shouldn't, for good reason, be scornful of Biden's impact on, if you're a Democrat, be scornful of his impact on your party. But I also think that we seem to be somewhat forgiving in a weird sense of sometimes these people are not, and I would say the same thing of Trump. I don't think these individuals are good for their brand, for the Democratic or Republican brands in the long run. And it just so happens that Biden burnt the bridges of the executive office also, so it's a little bit more visible.
Just to
you go ahead, John.
No, just to accentuate a quick point Blake made, and then I'll let you go, Tyler. Kamala Harris was the first losing candidate since 1976 to not flip a single state, and the first candidate since Hoover in 1932 to not flip a single county. That's how historically bad it was. Go ahead, Tyler. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no. I that actually I think helps go to my point. I said Biden's going to be blamed for the implosion of his party, but this has been an ongoing problem for Democrats. And in fact, the fact that Biden will be blamed entirely for it is actually maybe a little unfair to Biden.
Oh, no, I think that's totally fair.
Because this has been going on since the 90s. Bill Clinton lost historically. The Democrats, I think, and I wrote an article that recently, so just I'm rehashing my views, but the Democrats used to be the party of the working class. This is how they sold themselves. We're the ones who spend money on programs that help you. And then eventually, the kind of the New Deal in a way became political orthodoxy. Reagan, I think, tinkered with it in really important ways to limit its excesses, but at no point were we we're getting rid of the social safety net, we're getting rid of all regulation. And when that became the orthodoxy, I really think Democrats lost a strategy. I mean, they lost their connection with the base, and they've never found it since. They've not figured out how is it I connect with voters. What is it I sell voters when I'm going to sell voters stuff?
And to be fair, I don't know if anyone else in that primary was doing it. So, I mean, you're right. It's like Democratic Party was already going that direction. We can see how bad the other candidates were in the 2020 primary. Biden was, I mean, honestly, Biden, I don't like Trump. I don't think he's fit to be president, all this stuff. I'm not the kind of anti-Trumper that just everything is on fire and what, but like in 2020, I might have voted for Biden, even though I think he's thoroughly mediocre. But the pick of Kamala was so egregiously bad for a guy that was that old to me, to be like, you pick someone that has no experience at all. And I don't trust her to be a heartbeat away from the president. And to me, that was enough for me to go like, I don't trust you to be the president because that's the choice you made. It makes you seem unserious. But I think you're right. Like, who else? I mean, he was the most reasonable person in that field, pretty much, that had a chance. So I think you're right. It would have accelerated maybe a little bit, but I think he also could have done some things that would have bolstered the party and helped the party. And because he didn't do those, if you're the last, like, it doesn't really matter. If you're the last keeper of something when it kind of really is exposed for the problems it has, you're going to get the blame for it, even though there were plenty of other people that came before you.
Well, Exhibit A is Afghanistan, right? I mean, he gets the blame for it, but it's not as if Bush, Obama, Trump helped that along much.
And Trump, the exact same thing might have happened if Trump had been reelected on the same timeline, because it really was a Trump plan. Now, you can do all sorts of revisionist history to say, like, who would have listened to, maybe, because, like, it sounds like Biden just wanted to get out before September 11th. And it was just an arbitrary date for no other reason than it's a date on the calendar that we don't want to still be in Afghanistan on. I think that's unwise. If that really is the reason it was like, no, we got to go in August. I think, but you might be right, Jeffrey. It could have waited another year or 2 years or 10 years or 20 years. And maybe it's the debacle, and it's obviously, I think the other reason you shouldn't pay attention to polling, because like everyone said they wanted out of Afghanistan, and then it happened and everyone was like, well, not like that. We didn't want it. So I think politicians would benefit from stopping and trying to pay so much attention to what people think.
Oh. And I think one thing I hear about, I live in a very rural area, Eastern Kentucky. And in fact, my county did not vote for, you can watch the map. It's gotten redder as time goes, but they didn't vote for a Republican since FDR until John McCain. I have lots of friends here who are rural Democrats, and they're frustrated with Biden, on part because they think he's too poll driven. He's concerned about these issues that most voters are not that concerned about. And when he is concerned about them, he's concerned in the wrong way, like immigration. But also, they really like, for instance, the infrastructure bill that bring broadband to rural America. They think it's great. They think it's been, if you look at the timeline for how fast this is supposed to be rolled out, this is not the New Deal. This is not like, let's send in hundreds of workers right now and make this happen tomorrow. It's like, let's do this over 20 years and it'll be very environmentally friendly and all these things. And then he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't do anything to sort of engage this wing of the party that's withered and died. And I think in general, all of this, so I think Afghanistan is part of this. I think his kind of inability to even tout his own accomplishments is part of this. It's a very low energy presidency. This is why I think he'll mostly be remembered for the age. It seems so directionless and meandering, and it's not really going anywhere. And in fact, it didn't ever really go anywhere.
So do you think?
Just real quick, I meant to ask you, Tyler. Is that a picture of Henry Clay up there?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Love it.
I'm from Kentucky, so he's.
I'm sure it came with a house. No,
he's part of the deed. Yeah,
you don't have to be from Kentucky to be an admirer of Henry Clay.
Granted.
But it's required if you're in Kentucky.
Yes.
So I mean, I think that's interesting.
Statue of him in the Capitol.
I think it's interesting you bring that up, because my question then would be, do you think Democrats will learn the right lessons from their defeat this year, or do you think they'll just blame it on Biden and his age and think that that's the reason that stuff was unpopular? I don't know. I mean, I'm very curious, because we keep thinking people will learn their lessons, and it doesn't seem like either party does.
I think you're seeing that play out live. I think there are Democrats like Seth Moulton, for instance, who are trying to say, "Look, guys, maybe we really need to scale it back here a bit, and think about the fact that we're again, we used to be the party of the working class, and we're losing a lot of them to Trump, and maybe there's a reason for that, And yeah, the diehard ideologues like Liz Warren and the Squad and those types will never budge, but there probably is a lot of internal debate going on right now between the Seth Moultons of the party and the Spanbergers of the party versus the Squad types and over strategy going forward. I think you are seeing that.
But sort of the irony there, John, is that it's not like the diehard Elizabeth Warren Squad. They weren't the ones in charge in Biden's administration. We almost got the worst of both worlds, right? We got the nation thought it got the moderate that ran in 2020, and instead he became someone who tried to strike this unusual balance and never. Jonah Goldberg says this all the time: never had a sister soldier moment, right? Where never repudiated any excess on the far left. I don't think he was part of the far left. I think he just thought that they were supposed to be in the coalition and he couldn't possibly speak against them. And
yeah, I think he was scared to make him mad. I don't think he was. Does that make sense? There's a difference between someone and being scared to make him mad, and I think that's what it was. And I think some of his young staff, I think it's pretty clear that even Ron DeSantis has this problem of being and having a staff that's too online, and it's just not the real world. I think Biden's staff is also too online. And the truth is the nation is not where Twitter is. It's not where left-wing Twitter is. Yeah. And I think he was very scared to do things that would have pissed off some people on Twitter, and it never would have even made, the normies Instagram feed. Like it just wouldn't have.
Well, to be fair, I mean, frankly, I thought the Trump campaign was a little too online too.
They were too,
but,
for sure.
Yeah, but I think the difference is I think it was you who said it, Blake. I mean, I really think this election was more of just a reflection of the fact that they had 4 years of Trump, they got sick of that. They had 4 years of Biden, they got sick of that too. They got sick of the border, they got sick of the inflation, they got sick of all that.
And yet, will anyone learn the lesson that they don't really like me? They just hated the other guy, and maybe I just need to be. Just do the things that I'm supposed to do. I think that's the thing that Republicans and Democrats have not learned, that people just want the government to function and do the very few things that we actually want them to do. We don't want them to keep expanding, but I don't think we're saying that the right way, apparently. I'm
not sure I fully agree. I mean, I actually do think voters voted for Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm happy about this. But I do think that his economic narrative, anyways, which is which explains American decline, the idea that America's declining, the idea that he needs to intervene to fix this in various ways. I don't think most voters understand what tariffs are. I don't think they kind of get what he means when he says
I'm not
he's
sure
intervene.
That Trump understands what
tariffs
are.
I think that's a live question too. But I do
it's the most beautiful word in the English language. It's all you need to know.
What's funny is that I would think you were doing an exaggerated Saturday Night Live version of that, but that's exactly what he said in that interview this week. I mean, it's comical.
Sorry, Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, please. I mean, I do think the Overton window on economics has kind of moved to the left. I think that is kind of what the voters want to feel like their government's doing something to help them economically right now. Sometimes they blame the government for the economy, and sometimes they blame the government for not doing enough. And whether justly or not, I think they blame Biden for not doing enough to help the economy instead of maybe doing too much of the wrong thing.
I think you're right. I think most people are just kind of ignorant to most of how those economic factors work. Even though, I think it's fair to say that it wasn't all the spending that was inflationary, but that relief stuff that happened in March of 2021 was undoubtedly, we would have had some inflation, but that, I mean, most of the economists say that added 3, maybe 4% of the inflation that we saw. So a little less than half, and, or a third to a little less than half. And so I think people you're right. I don't think most people can connect those two dots. I don't think most people go, well, Biden's inflationary spending in March of 2021. I think they just go, I know stuff got a lot more expensive and he was the president. It's unfortunate that that's how we connect things, but you're right. It is how most voters do.
It is also
just a weird way in which they really want populist economics, but populist economics are in general pretty good for job growth. They're not great for inflation. They in fact make inflation worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have plenty of jobs, actually. That's a problem. Well, there is a sort of geographic problem where certain areas are losing jobs in certain areas, but that's different than what they're actually worried about.
Yeah.
So they don't even really want the right things quite often, which is bizarre.
Inflation's interesting in that it's and I don't take this, but I'm somewhere in the middle. I do think Biden's policies added to inflation. I don't think he's entirely to blame for them. To what degree, it's hard to say. But for the sake of conversation, let's just assume nothing he did in any way impacted inflation in the negative. I think the Biden administration is almost a masterclass in the dumbest way to go about the politics of this issue.
Yeah.
To consistently scold people for complaining about it and to claim it's transitional, and then to say, well, if we spend these hundreds of billions, somehow that's going to fix it. It was, and there, honestly, there was so much of that in his administration that it was this sort of help me help you. Like, you're not doing yourself any favor. There were so many unforced errors that it became exhausting.
Yeah, like what would you give for a politician that could just simply explain some of this stuff? Like one thing I will give RFK Jr. I don't trust him any further than I can throw him. I think he's a lunatic. But when he was campaigning for president, he was explaining things. Now, sometimes he was totally wrong about like the details of how whatever conspiracy theory he was spouting at the time. But he would go, here's how voting works, or here's why it's hard to get ballot access, or things like, he would actually explain what was going on as far as, because he's having to get ballot access and all this kind of stuff. And I think that is so, I didn't realize how bad it was that I was going, oh my God, RFK Jr. can actually like be a politician and can explain things to people. And I think that's why people like him. Whereas, to John's point, Trump will like in the middle of a campaign speech or whatever, or an interview, spout off something that only you would know if you were on right-wing Twitter all day, every day. And explains no context. And he did this in the debate all the time with Kamala Harris. He would bring up some random thing, and Joe Biden's the same way. Neither one of them can explain their point well enough. I'm a junkie for this stuff. And at both debates, I was going, okay, I actually figured out what he's talking about, but there's no way a normal person watching this could figure it out because I couldn't understand what he says, and I read this crap all day. So I think that's really the thing that both parties are going to be like desperate for, but maybe they don't realize it yet, is just someone that can communicate some of this stuff. And Biden definitely was not much better than Trump is at it. And I think
that's the strength of JD Vance. I don't like JD Vance either, but he's actually a very articulate, good explainer.
Yeah.
And he's often wrong, but and the Democrats have some people like this. They never seem to put them. But Josh Shapiro's good at explaining. Pete Buttigieg is pretty good at explaining, actually.
But it doesn't seem like if you have Pete Buttigieg in your administration, and to be fair, and then you picked Kamala Harris as your vice president, who is 0% better at explaining this kind of stuff than you are.
Maybe worse, actually.
Maybe worse. And it does seem like
she became vice president, anyways.
Yeah, what's really interesting about how it's just. I just think that there's so much work to be done there that Biden maybe even could have explained that stuff. And maybe it's not true. Maybe like he's BSing that none of the inflation was his fault. But like I said, if we're taking Josh's premise that that's the case, you should be able to explain better why it wasn't your fault then, or what the other circumstances are, or the reason things happen. But you're right. Most people, no one's getting out there and explaining, well, here's how inflation works. I mean, I think that if we interviewed 100 people, would we get 95 that wouldn't go, I have no idea if you ask them what causes inflation, would 95 people not say, I don't know? And that's a mark on kind of the voters and maybe the education system in America. But it certainly seems like the leader of a party or the president of the United States this is part of what you're supposed to do, right? It's kind of you're kind of a PR person for the federal government in some ways in America. And you need to be able to do that job. And you're right. Biden did not do it well.
I think we've come to think, and voters do think in sound bites, and voters do think in emotions, but none of which I actually think is all that new. But I think the problem is politicians and campaign workers have come to believe that too much. That if you can't fit it in a 10-second TikTok, no voter is going to care.
Yep.
And if you can't, so if you're explaining, you're always wrong. Now, sometimes you actually have to explain. And not offering an explanation is actually going to make you look more out of touch and clueless than maybe you even are. Just not to say that Biden isn't kind of out of touch and clueless, but
well, frankly, I was just going to say with the when it comes to the debates, I mean, I thought during the Trump-Harris debate, I thought Harris got the better end of him there. I mean, I thought the only thing people were going to remember from that debate was they're eating the dogs and they're eating the cats.
Yeah.
So, but clearly it didn't have an effect. I mean, almost every state, he still swept all the swing states. So,
and that's why I think it did have the effect, because I mean, I think most people were rolling their eyes at that. They were just willing to still vote for him. I mean, I think there was obviously a huge chunk of the country that rejected him in 2020 and continued to reject his sort of candidates in midterms in 2022 even and stuff. And I think it was until it's like they were both the only people they could beat. Like Biden could only beat Trump. He couldn't have beat anyone else in the field of Republican candidates. And Trump probably couldn't have beaten anyone else other than him and Harris, maybe every other Democrat. But like, if you had a normal primary system, if Biden had dropped out 2 years ago, Democrats had a normal primary system where they selected the best candidate. I don't think Trump can beat that candidate, even with all the Biden crap, if that candidate did a good job at saying like, yeah, Biden screwed all this crap up, but I'm not going to.
Which is arguably almost anyone other than Kamala Harris could have done that.
Josh Shapiro doesn't have any connection to the Biden-Harris administration. Pete Buttigieg would. I mean, like some people, if you work in the administration, but I think it would have been easy for a governor or, maybe even a senator or someone like that. I don't know who it would have been. Obviously, no one put their hat in the ring once he dropped out. But
by the way, I was taking note of
shortlist for vice president would have been a much better candidate for president. Even Tim Walz, who I don't actually think performed exceptionally well.
I think he did pretty bad. Yeah, I don't.
But I still think he would have done better than Harris.
Oh yeah, I don't think Shapiro could have done. Shapiro, I don't think could have gotten her over the line. I mean, I did say if she loses Pennsylvania, she lost all the stuff. But I mean, I do think you're right.
Could fix that.
I think that he's at least been a governor. I mean, I don't know. You're right. There's just so many things. But again, it all points back to Biden. It's like if Biden would have left earlier, or if Biden just would have been honest about his shortcomings or age, or even just said, hey, I said I was going to be a bridge. I said I was going to stop Trump. And I'm here. I'm doing those two things. Those were my promises. I think he would have gone down as consequential, even if he did none of those other things. Even if those are the only two things he did was, not let Trump get a second election and then like leave so that his party isn't in shambles.
So Blake, what you're saying is, of course, what probably all four of us have heard repeated often on the, I'll say right of center media, that, and I believe this myself, or at least it was my perception, that the nation elected what they thought was a relatively moderate Democrat to bring us back to normal. And to whatever extent Biden had a mandate, it wasn't for Build Back Better. It was for, it was for that. It was sort of, hey, we hate COVID. We're tired of the country feeling like everybody's tearing each other apart. I'm just curious, though, is that, are we maybe in an echo chamber there? Or is that what the country wanted? I mean, clearly they didn't want what they got, but because the way that narrative typically goes is just what you said. Biden could have been this 4-year transitional president that would have cemented or secured the Democratic Party. It would be almost imperceivable that Donald Trump could have swept in again and run re-election had Biden been a pretty sensible candidate, stepped out, and then the Democratic Party had nominated someone who was a strong candidate. Is it possible that's wrong? Is it possible that that the American people are more fit? And part of the reason I'm saying this is because what has struck me in the elections of 2016 and 2020 in particular was just how much in the minority I am, and how much Americans do in fact seem okay with individuals who I would have assumed we would have collectively said need to be nowhere near the White House.
I think we might know early into Trump's administration on his favorability numbers. I know I don't really love that to be the bellwether for if a president's good or not. I don't think it matters that much because I think people are kind of stupid when it comes to that kind of general polling stuff. I just think I don't trust it very much. But I think if you see Trump do stuff that they go, no, and like his favorability drops, I think that it will be clear that this is just we're just rejecting, like, this is not what we wanted.
Yeah.
And it is hard. You're right. Maybe it is echo chambery, but I guess the reason I don't think it is because I think that maybe that would have let's say he does those things that I said earlier in the show about, like, he reins in some executive powers that he thinks this has gotten out of hand. He, I don't know, just does that kind of stuff. And literally he's like, I think that was my job. You wanted me to not beat Trump. You wanted me to end COVID, and you wanted me to, let's pretend maybe even the border and stuff, that doesn't happen, because I think the border was a huge problem for him.
Yeah.
And I think that turns out that Abbott's gamble of running people up to Chicago, New York, I think that helped Trump more than anything. I think that once this
100%.
a blue state problem and blue city problem, it really, that was the floodgates, because Fox was talking about the border for a long time, and it was not on Washington's radar really at all. And that stuff changed it. And obviously, I think it was very obvious to everyone, because economics, complicated, I'll give him that. It's really obvious that, okay, there weren't millions of people flooding over the border, and all of a sudden Biden undoes some stuff, and now there are millions of people flooding across the border. It really was that cut and dry. There was no, it's really hard to blame someone else for that. And then to say, no, Congress has to do it. And then when they don't do it, to be fair, when Trump tells them not to do it, he just signs those things again, and all of a sudden the border is back to normal. So I think that the border alone is the good example of people were rejecting the actions that Biden did. And I think even if we were on the fence about, were people really punishing for the economy? Were they saying, no, we just wanted you to be moderate? I don't know. I think you're right. Maybe that's reading the tea leaves a little bit too much, but I think we'll find out if Trump is very unpopular early into his presidency because he does some stuff that hurts the wallets. Like, I think if he did the tariffs across the board, people will feel an immediate squeeze on their wallet, and I think we'll be immediately pissed off about it. Most things take a little more time than that, but I'm not sure that, like I said, I really tried to look at this from let's just be a Biden apologist and try to figure out what the pros are. And I think every pro kind of gets outweighed by some other thing. And it's interesting to me that he did all that work to pander to the progressives, and they hate him as much as anyone. So what was it for?
I do think it was. I think he was elected to be a moderate, but I think as the situation grew worse, I think he wasn't rejected because he wasn't a moderate anymore. I think he was rejected because Americans, as Blake said, they're rejecting him in particular, not his lack of moderation or anything like that. It's his actual policies. And I think as time went on, they came to reject the Democrats too.
I think you're right.
Of mixture of identity politics and because Democrats also have a kind of corporate, I always call it corporate identity politics, because it's not even fully progressive like the mainstream of the party. It's some odd, horrendous hybrid that's specifically designed to offend the average voter.
And I think I think they won't learn that lesson, though, because I think that it'll be too convenient to blame it all on Biden. And I do think Biden had a lot to do. I do think it did creep into Democrats, because they did not, it wasn't just Biden that lost, and it wasn't just Harris that lost. It was senators, it was congressmen. I don't think they gained any governorships, did they? I can't remember that. I don't think they flipped
in North Carolina.
Oh,
it wasn't flipped.
It was a hold. It was a hold for them. Black Nazi. I mean, it's sadder if you lose.
Yeah, you're right. That was the one. You're right. They just kept it, but it probably should have been back to Republicans. So maybe that's the example. But really, other than that, they didn't do well across the board.
By the way, one thing worth noting, I was checking this out about a week ago. Obviously, Trump's coattails, they arguably they might have carried some Senate candidates over the finish line for Republicans, but not others. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, those were all losses. Additionally, there were actually 13 House Democrats that won in districts Trump won.
Yeah,
and only 3 Republicans who won in Harris districts. 2 of them Harris barely won. But clearly there are some Democrats that are capable of, disassociating themselves with the far left of their party and can still manage to win in a Trump district.
I also think that also proves how Republicans do not have the mandate they are claiming they have right now, because that only happened in Maine before, where the top of the ticket, the president won and the senator from the opposite party won. And Susan Collins is kind of a anomaly there because you're a blue state and it's a Republican. It's a little Joe Manchin-ish. And so, that was the only state. And this one, you're right, Trump lost 4. There were 4 senators that lost. Now, to be fair, one of those is Carrie Lake, we had a couple terrible candidates in those, but they were Trumpy candidates, which is, I think, kind of proves the point that I don't think people are as on the Trump train as they are, like I said, I think Biden was a rejection of Trump, and I think Trump was a rejection of Biden.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of people that really like Trump, and I think he did actually. I think the black men and some of those people, I think he's kind of pulled into his fold, and it wasn't just a rejection of Biden. But I don't think those were the huge numbers that they can count on going forward. I don't think it's like they're safe in the midterms because of those people that came and voted in 2024. I think that they'd have to do the right things to keep those people.
I think one of the funniest things I saw in that.
Oh, wait.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you had mentioned Carrie Lake. I think one of the funniest things I saw during the election, you guys might have seen this, was a big billboard. I think there are multiple billboards that went up over the state of Arizona. Donald Trump in the center, then Vance and Vivek Ramaswamy. And it was kind of the Trump, cheerleaders, if you were. And it says something about Arizona, Oklahoma. It was paid for by the the Arizona GOP. I think I could be wrong about that. But conspicuously missing from that billboard was Carrie Lake.
She's not that popular in that state.
She's not that popular. Go ahead, Tyler.
I was just something that fascinates me. I agree. I don't think Trump is he's not like the new FDR or the new Reagan. Like, he's not, in some respects. I mean, he's not going to be like this universally beloved guy. I see no evidence of that. But I cannot. I'm inclined to think this, but I'm not 100% convinced that he has maybe reshaped the Republican Party. I mean, he's reshaped what is the Republican coalition, basically. He has brought in people, black men, certain pockets of the working class that are probably Republican for the rest of their lives. And so I'm inclined to think, anyways, that he's changed the Republican Party. I mean, obviously he's changed it forever, but he's really changed what it means to be a Republican forever. And that this will probably itself have to change a little bit for the party to kind of continue flourishing. But I do think Democrats are in a far worse. I was just watching Mitt Romney's kind of postmortem on his career with Jake Tapper. And I think Mitt Romney did say it perfectly. It was like the Republican base has completely changed, said Mitt Romney. And and Mitt Romney thinks it's permanent. I'm inclined to think it's kind of permanent too. He said, and the Democrats, he said, are screwed. They don't have a base anymore.
Well, or it's too small. They do have a base. It's just not small. Well, yeah. It's just not enough people.
Kind of undercuts his own comment because he said, it's like a hot bunch of Hollywood people and professors, and that this is the base, which is not a workable political base.
No.
So I think we are going through a realignment of the parties, but I do think that's where Trump's impact is going to be, not as some like beloved savior of the nation, which he seems to think will be his reputation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's totally fair.
John, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say coastal elites. I mean, that's essentially the
Well, and it's just, they might have money and power and media access, but they just don't. There aren't enough of them, and I think
it doesn't equal numbers. Yeah, exactly.
I think you're right. If I had to pick, a party to be in charge of right now, it's not just because Republicans won, because as a guy that is very not into the direction Republicans are going, because I think it's a bad direction, because I think it's mostly they're just doing the same thing Democrats did. And I don't think it worked well when Democrats did it. I think it will also not work well when Republicans do it, because I don't think it works well for government. But so I think that it won't take very long for them to be punished for those things. It would just because I think they don't work. But I do think I would not want to be in charge of the Democrats, because I think I think while it's more obvious what's wrong, I don't think they can fix it without pissing off the only people that are enthusiastic about the party. Yeah. And so you literally have to trade some people for potentially no people. And I just don't think they're willing to roll the dice on pissing off either the super progressive crowd or the identity politics crowd, or even like the sort of elite crowd, because the populism thing, not to bring it up, but I mean, the whole United Healthcare CEO thing is showing me some very weird things that are aligned between the right and left, which is a very anti-elite. Well, like if that's your base as the Democrats, how are you going to go all in on that without completely eliminating your base? So I would not take that job. I mean,
we're coming, we're a bit past the hour. I don't want to hold you gentlemen too much longer. It's been a great conversation. I do want to give each of you an opportunity for some closing thoughts. I did note throughout this entire conversation, we have evoked an enormous amount of names of current individuals who have done things, politically speaking, very savvy, very intelligent, and very much not so. But I think in every single case, we've always prefaced it with, now, I don't like the guy, so I'm praying for an era in which we'll have some sort of a leader so we can say, hey, I at least like this person. It's kind of, it speaks, Blake, to your homeless conservative is a sentiment I can share. And I, to be honest, there are still men and women of courage and integrity, though few they may be. They are out there in the halls of Congress and by God's grace in the incoming administration too. That being said, I wanted to give each, and if you have any closing thoughts that's kind of outside this realm, that's more than fine if you want to share them. But I was wondering if each of you could kind of share what you think years from now, the big three things we will remember, good or bad, we will be remembering the Biden administration for.
Oh boy, three things. I think that unfortunately for him, although I think it's going to be fair, I think the very first thing that's going to be mentioned is Hunter's pardon. I think that the scope of it was outrageous. I think, and most people, even Democrats, are kind of coming out and saying, although I'm surprised more aren't. I'm a little surprised that more people aren't using that as an excuse to really like cut the tie, and because they're going to have to continue to govern. And I think he's still sort of an albatross potentially going forward, because who else is going to be? But I think that'll be the first thing people remember is the Hunter pardon, the lying about it, the doing it, the scope of it. I think that that's going to be the thing people remember. I also think that people will just remember the age. I think that and I honestly think that the secondary knock-on effect that I think will matter more in the future is how much it discredited the media and kind of the Democrats in the process. That it was such a blatantly obvious lie. I don't know, like we can all see with our eyes what was happening. And so I think the knock-on effects of that, like the Hunter Biden pardon and the knock-on effects that like traditional media will, I think, never be the same. And they were already, like I said, not Biden's fault. Like they were going that way anyway. They'd already lost a lot of trust. But I think very clearly this election was such a switch to sort of the podcast medium. We weren't really paying attention to the mainstream news. And I think part of that was because they were telling us that, oh, this is fine. What was Joe Scarborough's thing? It was like, he's the best version of, I think that stuff's going to be the thing that people remember. And that's not entirely Biden's fault. I think that's a totally fair point, but that doesn't matter. That's how it's going to work out, I think, in the history books.
Before we go to Tyler or John, right quick, The Homeless Conservative, how do people find that, Blake?
You can find it at thehomelessconservative.com, or the podcast is on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all those kind of things.
Aside from the trivia point that Biden will essentially be the Benjamin Harrison sandwiched in between the two non-consecutive terms of Donald Trump. It's kind of funny. On the one hand, he might be remembered in the history books at least for the near future until someone breaks it. Technically, he's still the presidential candidate that got the most votes in any given election with 81 million. So there's that. I think Blake mentioned this earlier. I think he will be remembered for crashing and burning in his one debate with Trump earlier back in June. That will probably go down in the history books as well. And honestly, I really do think the whole illegal immigration border crisis will really go down in the history books as one of his legacy items.
I think the first one will be his age. The debate will be part of that, but I think if you ask a random person on the street 100 years from now, what do you know about Joe Biden? honestly, the real honest answer is probably not much. But what if they do know a little bit of history? They're going to say he was really, really old. They parted his son, or something like this. Something about some kind of personal corruption. I think it's somewhat unfortunate. I think it was like, I think he did obviously the very wrong thing, but it's not like this. This is the most deeply corrupt administration compared to many of them. But nonetheless, they'll remember that. And then I think potentially they'll say, he was the president between Trump. And I'm inclined to think he will be blamed for that. But you never quite know how history will work. But I think that will be kind of a condemnation. He's the guy who let Trump win again.
I think that's spot on. I think that's probably I think we've not mentioned enough that you can't say Biden's name without saying Trump, because even the people that defend him always go to the whataboutism of Trump. And I think that you're right. Like that might be the worst part of someone's legacy, that you have to be a little bit of an egomaniac to be the president. But I mean, the fact that no one's going to say your name without also saying Donald Trump's name for forever is probably not fun.
And I'm not saying Donald Trump is the Civil War, but it's like James Buchanan. What do you all know about James Buchanan? He's the president when the South starts to secede, and he doesn't really do anything about it. It'll be similar, I think.
In all fairness, I need to work in. This is sort of like when someone mentions the name Hitler. I always have to caveat. I'm not saying this person's like Hitler. Biden is nothing like James Buchanan. Even the point's well taken, and I'm not saying you're saying that. It just needs to.
I didn't mean to say, but it's the same kind of, I think, unfortunate, kind of remembered for the thing he didn't prevent.
Right. No, I think you're right. I just didn't want to leave.
Or Hoover is
right,
universally sort of blamed for not ending the Great Depression and so on.
And most of the
not that Trump is the Great Depression, so we'll see what the tariffs do. But
God help us all. Well, and it did, to try to end on a positive note, it did occur to me there was at least one individual we could all collectively agree was worth looking to, and that is the portrait behind you, Tyler, of Henry Clay. Hopefully someone within the last couple hundred years, or someone a little bit closer to currently, that has the good fortune of currently being alive, will take the reins here soon, and we can I don't want to say return to normal, because that seems almost too much to hope for these days, but at least hopefully someday down the road we'll have more sensible leaders. In the meanwhile, it's always fun to talk about it. John, Blake, Tyler, it's always good to chat with all three of you gentlemen. I'm glad I could get all of you on at the same time, because it's I love that ping pong. Thank you to the audience who hung with us. Thank you for everyone who's watching out there, and we will see you guys next time.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
You have a great evening.